5:42 a.m. local time. Eastern approach to the Strait of Hormuz. The first sign of trouble did not appear on the horizon. It appeared on a monitor. Inside the Combat Information Center of the lead American escort, the air search display was already busy with the usual early morning pattern. Routine traffic, patrol routes, and familiar regional surveillance tracks. Then a new group appeared high to the southwest. Large returns, clean spacing, steady speed. Too deliberate to be civilian, too substantial to ignore. The watch supervisor leaned closer to the screen. For 2 seconds, no one spoke. Then the identification team got to work in short, precise bursts. Multiple heavy airborne contacts. High altitude, stable formation, moving toward the Hormuz corridor. On the bridge, the sea still looked calm. Pale gray light spread across the water. Commercial ships continued through their assigned lanes. Off the port bow, an Iranian patrol vessel shadowed the American formation from a careful distance, staying just beyond the point that would trigger an immediate response. From the outside, nothing seemed different. Inside CIC, everything had changed. The data link lit up first, then the voice circuit. Farther out, an E-2D Hawkeye fed confirmation into the network. These were not random tracks. They were part of a structured package moving with support, timing, and discipline. A moment later, the classification became firm. B-52 bombers. No one in the room reacted visibly. No one had to. The meaning was obvious at once. The bombers were still high, still distant, still well outside any reckless profile. But their presence instantly changed the geometry of the entire strait. Every radar on the coast would see them. Every patrol commander in the region would have to recalculate. A corridor that had felt tense only minutes earlier now sat beneath the weight of long-range air power. The tactical action officer gave the next order without raising his voice. Raise readiness. Hold present course. Track all Iranian surface movement. The destroyer did not turn, and that mattered. There was no dramatic course change, no blaring alarm, no visible rush on deck. That was the message. The American formation kept moving forward with the controlled pace of a force that had expected this moment before it arrived. On the surface display, 2 U.S. escorts maintained their spacing around the central transit lane, while optical systems shifted toward the nearest Iranian contacts. At 5:47, the Iranian patrol vessel to the north increased speed. It was not a charge, not yet. But its bow wake sharpened and its track bent just enough to show intent. On another screen, 3 smaller fast boats closer to shore broke away from a loose cluster and began moving southeast, angling for a better view of the American ships and the airspace above them. Bridge watchstanders on the U.S. side reported the movement. CIC marked it. Electronic support teams logged a rise in emissions from the coast. Iranian radar activity was building layer by layer, one signal after another, as though the shoreline itself were waking up. Overhead, the bomber package continued. Then the operators noticed something else. Behind the B-52s, farther back and not yet centered in the tactical picture, additional returns began to stand out. Larger than fighters, slower than escorts, flying in disciplined intervals. At first they looked like distant support traffic buried inside the broader air package. Then the spacing repeated. Then it repeated again. The air controller narrowed the filter and stared. Additional heavy tracks behind the primary group. The supervisor turned. Type unknown. Transport profile. Multiple aircraft. That changed the feel of the room. Bombers alone could signal pressure. Bombers followed by supporting transports suggested planning, sequence, and intent to carry the operation further. On the bridge wing, binoculars stayed fixed on the water because in Hormuz, danger usually reveals itself there first. But the real shift that morning was taking place far above the sightline, where the air picture had become too organized to dismiss as mere theater. At 5:52, one of the Iranian fast boats pushed farther out than the others, cutting across the dark blue water in a hard diagonal line. Its movement was aggressive enough to be noticed, controlled enough to remain technically below the level of open provocation. The American destroyer answered the way disciplined crews are trained to respond: document everything, change nothing that could be mistaken for hesitation. Range calls came in. Bearing updates followed. Electro-optical cameras locked on. The captain remained on the bridge, silent, watching the boat, then the sky, then the merchant lanes ahead. Above them all, the first B-52s reached the outer edge of the corridor. Not diving, not rushing, simply arriving. At 5:57, the unknown aircraft behind them resolved more clearly on U.S. screens. Transport-class signatures, multiple, following a route that lined up too neatly with the open water approaches east of Hormuz. One operator spoke without taking his eyes off the display. This is not just a bomber pass. No one answered because no one needed to. The Iranian boats were still moving. Coastal radars were still sweeping. The American ships were still holding course. But the shape of the operation had finally exposed its deeper layer. The bombers were only the leading edge. Something else was coming behind them. And whatever it was being brought into Hormuz on purpose. 6:04 a.m. local time. Air corridor east of Hormuz. By then, no one inside the American tactical network treated the incoming formation as a simple flyover. The bomber tracks were already established high above the corridor, broad and deliberate, holding the kind of altitude that projected control without tipping the situation into chaos. Below them, the sea picture remained tense but contained. Iranian patrol craft still shadowed from offset angles. Fast boats stayed active along the outer edge of the waterline. No one had crossed the line. Not yet. Then the aircraft behind the B-52s came fully into focus. Inside CIC, the returns were now too clear to misread. Heavy transports, multiple, evenly spaced, moving along a route that had been cleaned and protected before they ever arrived. Support elements were layered around them with exact timing. Radar coverage overlapped. Communications stayed brief and controlled. The escorts above were not improvising. They were constructing a lane. One American controller studied the display a moment longer than usual, then keyed the circuit. An air corridor is being built. The sentence settled over the room with the weight of certainty. The bridge heard it next. No visible reaction, only a subtle tightening in posture. Lookouts stayed on glass. Helm held course. Engine output remained steady. The destroyer's wake cut a straight white line through the morning water while the entire formation moved forward, as if this had always been the expected shape of the day. At 6:06, the Iranian side adjusted again. A larger patrol vessel to the north slowed slightly, turning just enough to improve its angle on the sky. 3 fast boats to the east spread wider from one another, no longer moving as a loose pack. Now they were probing for approach lanes, testing the edges of American intent. From shore, emissions kept rising. Search radars, fire control support systems, command relay traffic. The coast was no longer simply observing, it was measuring. Overhead, the U.S. package tightened further. An MH-60 helicopter lifted from one of the escorts and climbed out over the water, nose pointed toward the eastern sector. It did not sprint. It widened the American view. Higher still, Combat Air Patrol remained on station, invisible from the deck, but present on every screen that mattered. The B-52s held their line above the growing pattern like a ceiling of steel. Then the first transport began to descend. Not sharply, not enough to trigger panic, just enough for everyone watching the air picture to understand that the next phase was no longer theoretical. Inside the aircraft, the process had already begun. Crew chiefs moved through the cargo bay. Loadmasters checked anchor lines and equipment one last time. Red light washed over helmets, harnesses, and motionless faces. Every buckle had been inspected already. Every step had been rehearsed already. No one needed a speech. No one needed an explanation. The roar inside the fuselage drowned out everything except hand signals and drilled instinct. Back over the water, Iran made its first direct attempt to disrupt the atmosphere of control. A warning came across the military distress frequency, ordering unidentified aircraft to alter course and leave the area. The transmission was sharp, official, and clearly meant to be heard by every receiver in range. The American side did not argue. There was no lengthy exchange, only brief procedural replies from aviation controllers, maintaining separation and asserting safe passage within the operating lane. The transports kept coming. At 6:09, the nearest fast boat accelerated again, this time pushing farther out from the Iranian side of the waterline. Its wake brightened in the early sun. Another followed. The movement was fast enough to draw close attention, controlled enough to stop short of a direct intercept. CIC marked both tracks immediately. Surface contacts, increasing speed, maintain record, continue air priority. That was the rhythm now. Surface pressure, observed. Air mission protected. At 6:10, one of the transport aircraft reached the entry point of the corridor. Its rear ramp opened. On the shipboard optical feed, the distance reduced everything to shape and shadow. But inside the aircraft, everything changed at once. The noise deepened as the slipstream tore through the open ramp. Red light gave way. Harnesses were checked again, not from doubt, but from instinct. Men rose from the side benches in sequence and moved toward the rear. Each clipped into the system, each took the exact place assigned long before the wheels had ever left the runway. The loadmaster looked down the line, then toward the opening. Green was next. Below, the Strait of Hormuz suddenly felt smaller. Warships, patrol craft, merchant lanes, and surveillance coverage all seemed compressed into one narrow stretch of water where every movement carried weight. By then, Iranian crews on the surface could see the full structure of the American air package overhead. It was no longer just bombers, no longer just escorts. Something heavier was taking shape, something far more deliberate, a pattern that pointed toward insertion. On the destroyer's bridge, one lookout lifted binoculars toward the distant formation. Inside CIC, nobody spoke unless they had to. The room had become pure function. At 6:11, the transport crossed the release line. Inside the aircraft, the light changed. A jumpmaster turned, gave the signal, and the first line of paratroopers stepped forward into the roaring open sky above Hormuz. At 6:12 local time, over the eastern corridor of the strait, the first paratrooper vanished into the slipstream without hesitation. 1 second later, the next followed. Then another. Then another. From the rear ramp, the jump line became a steady mechanical flow of bodies into open air, each man swallowed by the wind for a brief instant before his parachute opened above the waterway. Inside the cargo bay, nothing was wasted. No dramatic shouting, no chaotic movement, only the hard rhythm of training carried out under weight, noise, and pressure. Green light, step, exit. Clear. Outside, the sky changed its shape. What had been a clean military corridor only moments earlier now began to fill with descending canopies opening in sequence over the water approaches east of Hormuz. White parachutes and darker tactical canopies spread across the morning air at disciplined intervals, each one marking the exact timing of a plan that had moved from signal to execution without pause. From the surface, the effect was immediate. One Iranian fast boat that had been pushing outward slowed first, not because of a visible order, but because the scene above had become impossible to ignore. Another held speed for 2 more seconds, then shifted slightly as its crew looked up through spray and glare at the descending formation. Even from sea level, even through distance and movement, the scale of coordination was unmistakable. The shock was not in destruction. It was in precision. High above the drop lane, the B-52 still held altitude, broad dark shapes moving with cold steadiness across the upper layer of the operation. They did not dive. They did not break formation. They remained what they had been from the start that morning. Weight in the sky, pressure without chaos. Beneath them, the transports carried out the insertion. Higher still and farther out, fighter cover maintained its screen. On the water, U.S. escorts held course through the strait, while an MH-60 widened the maritime picture below the descending troops. Air, sea, timing, everything was connected. By 6:13, the first parachutes were drifting lower toward the designated drop zone east of the busiest transit lanes. The wind over the water was stronger than it had appeared from altitude. Inside CIC aboard the lead escort, drift calculations were already updating in real time. Controllers watched symbols move across their overlays, while radio circuits stayed tightly controlled. Every transmission had been reduced to what mattered most: heading, speed, correction, separation. No one was talking about fear. There was too much to do. Inside one of the American ships, the tactical action officer leaned over the display as the jump picture developed. Surface contacts remained active. Iranian fast boats had not withdrawn. Coastal radar emissions were still pulsing from the shoreline. Nothing about the environment was secure. That was exactly why every second of the drop mattered. At 6:14, the first complication hit. A cluster of jumpers on the southern edge of the formation began drifting farther than planned under a stronger crosswind. Not wildly, not enough to break the operation, but enough to demand immediate correction. Adjustment calls moved through the net at once. Recovery timing shifted. One helicopter crew was retasked to monitor the lower edge of the descent pattern. On shipboard displays, new lines were drawn, then redrawn. Above the water, the paratroopers responded the way trained airborne troops respond when conditions stop matching the textbook. They corrected under canopy, spread slightly, then turned back toward the intended assembly area with the kind of discipline that cannot be improvised once boots have already left the aircraft. Iranian crews saw that too. From their position on the water, this was clearly no loose spectacle and no symbolic demonstration. It was an insertion protected by layered aviation, observed by warships, and adjusted in real time without visible confusion. That was what changed the atmosphere. Not simply that American paratroopers were descending over Hormuz, but that the entire structure around them remained calm while it happened. At 6:15, one Iranian fast boat accelerated again, this time edging toward the outer boundary of the drop zone as if testing for reaction. The move was noticed immediately. Optical systems locked. Range was called. The MH-60 dropped lower and turned toward the contact, not attacking, not rushing, just making its presence impossible to misunderstand. A warning went out across the surface channel. Short, direct, final. The Iranian boat held its line for several more seconds. Spray rose from its bow, then its angle shifted. Not much, but enough to reveal hesitation. The boat stayed outside the protected edge, still moving, still watching, but no longer closing as hard as before. That hesitation mattered, because at that same moment, the first American paratroopers were touching down. One after another, they hit the designated surface and shoreline approaches with the hard, abrupt landings of a combat insertion. Parachutes collapsed, harnesses came free, weapons were brought in close. Small groups formed almost immediately, each man moving toward the next task before the last canopy had even finished settling. More jumpers came down behind them. By 6:16, the main body of the drop was nearly complete. The final sticks exited in disciplined sequence, while those already on the ground began consolidating into ordered elements. Above them, the B-52 still had not left the wider area. Their role had not changed. Their silence was part of the pressure. On the water, Iranian boats continued circling at distance, no longer driving blindly into uncertainty, no longer setting the pace. They had not been engaged. They had not been struck. But the initiative they had been testing all morning was no longer theirs. The last parachutes opened high over the corridor. The last men descended, and with the drop nearly complete, the most dangerous phase still lay ahead. The moment when everyone on the water would decide what came next. At 6:19 local time, on the eastern edge of the Strait of Hormuz, the last parachutes were still collapsing on the ground when the contest for the waterline began. Not open combat. Not yet. A contest for distance, for nerve, for the right to keep moving without being forced to react. In the designated drop area, American paratroopers were already compressing into organized elements. Canopies were stripped away and dragged clear. Equipment bundles were recovered. Team leaders counted heads, checked spacing, and pushed their men into the first defensive positions with the speed of a force that had expected no pause between landing and possible contact. What mattered now was no longer the jump. It was the first 3 minutes after it. Out on the water, U.S. ships adjusted almost invisibly. The lead escort held the main axis through the corridor, keeping its bow steady and its profile unchanged. A second warship widened the maritime screen by a few degrees, enough to expand observation and close gaps in the surface picture without broadcasting a dramatic maneuver. The MH-60 that had been shadowing the drop zone lowered again and began a tighter pattern between the outer edge of the paratroopers' position and the nearest Iranian contacts. Higher above, ISR coverage remained locked over the entire operating box. Everything American forces did in that minute served the same purpose. Hold the shape, deny surprise, surrender no tempo. At 6:20, the Iranian side made its clearest move of the morning. 3 fast boats accelerated together from the northeastern sector, forming a shallow wedge as they cut across the water toward the outer edge of the American activity zone. Their wakes brightened in parallel behind them. They were no longer wandering. They were probing with purpose, fast enough to create pressure, controlled enough to preserve ambiguity. Inside CIC, the tracks were marked at once. 3 fast contacts bearing 041, speed increasing. The tactical action officer did not look up. Project line. A projected intercept arc appeared across the display, reaching toward the maritime edge closest to the drop area. Not a collision course, not yet, but close enough to trigger the next layer of procedure. On the bridge, the captain watched through binoculars for a full second, then lowered them, warned them. The first surface warning went out over bridge-to-bridge frequency, clear and unhurried. U.S. forces were conducting military operations. Maintain safe separation. Do not enter the restricted area. No reply came back. The Iranian boats kept coming. At 6:21, the MH-60 turned nose on toward the wedge and dropped lower, rotor wash hammering the surface as it moved into a position that could not be ignored. It did not attack. It did not posture wildly. It simply occupied the most important piece of airspace between the approaching boats and the men who had just landed. That move changed the geometry. Now the Iranian crews had a helicopter ahead of them, warships off their flank, and optical systems measuring every meter of their approach. On American displays, laser rangefinding, EO feeds, and radar plots converged into one clean, tightening problem. Range decreasing, marking lead hull, 2,000 yards. Ashore, the paratroopers kept working without visible interruption. That was the discipline of it. On the ground, the men moved fast and without hesitation, locking in their perimeter while the situation at sea unfolded just beyond it. No one froze, no one waited. Every unit stayed inside its role, executing the sequence exactly as planned. At 6:22, the lead Iranian boat ignored the first exit option. Its bow stayed low, its wake sharp and aggressive. The 2 boats behind it tightened their formation, compressing into a wedge, as if testing whether the Americans would go beyond warnings. A second warning was transmitted, shorter this time, closer to final. On the bridge of the U.S. escort, there was no shouting. The helm held steady. Weapons crews were ready but not put on display. The destroyer moved forward through blue water with a quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need to look urgent to be taken seriously. Then came the closest moment of the morning. At 6:23, the lead Iranian boat pushed just a little farther. Not enough to trigger immediate escalation, but enough to make every range call feel tighter than the last. The MH-60 dropped lower and cut directly across its path, throwing up noise, spray, and a clear signal of intent. At the same time, the American ship's sensors stayed locked, every camera recording, every line measured. For 4 seconds, the boat kept coming. For 4 seconds, the entire strait seemed balanced on a single decision. Then the bow lifted. The throttle eased back. Speed dropped. There was no dramatic turn, no panic, just a subtle release of pressure, the smallest possible move that still changed everything. Behind it, the other two boats hesitated for a fraction of a second, then broke formation, peeling away to port and starboard. The wedge dissolved. Inside CIC, no one celebrated. They measured. Lead contact slowing. Trail contacts turning out. Boundary holding. That was enough. By 6:24, the Iranian boats were still there, armed, watching, but no longer controlling the edge of the encounter. The Americans had drawn the line, held it, and stopped the advance without a single shot. On shore, the paratroopers completed their first consolidation. Accountability reports began moving through the network. Outer security was established. The drop zone was no longer a vulnerable landing area. It had become a controlled position. Over the water, the MH-60 climbed slightly and resumed its wider orbit. The escorts maintained formation. The B-52s, now farther from the center of activity, continued moving away from the most sensitive part of the corridor. But their earlier presence still lingered, like a weight no one could ignore. By 6:25, the most dangerous test had passed. Not because the threat disappeared, but because it had reached the line and found no weakness. That morning, Hormuz did not erupt into chaos. But for the first time since the bombers appeared, Iranian movement had been forced to stop. At 6:31 local time, the shape of the operation was no longer in question. The B-52s had begun easing out of the corridor, maintaining altitude as they moved away. The transports were already clear of the drop lane. Fighter cover remained overhead. The MH-60 continued its pattern above the waterline. On the surface, American escorts held steady formation. On shore, the paratroopers who had entered minutes earlier were no longer descending. They were established. That was the moment everything shifted. Not with a launch, not with impact, not with a warning shot, with completion. Every phase had been carried out inside one of the most compressed and high-stakes maritime corridors in the world, and it had all unfolded on schedule. The bombers arrived first and reshaped the airspace. The transports followed through a secured corridor. The drop happened under observation, under pressure, and under constant tracking. The surface was tested, the line held, and by 6:31, the operation had moved from insertion to consolidation. Inside the Combat Information Center of the lead escort, the atmosphere didn't relax, it sharpened. When the most critical moments pass in a professional operation, the work doesn't end. It becomes more precise. Surface contacts were still tracked. Iranian boats remained scattered at distance, no longer pushing forward, no longer forming aggressive patterns, but still close enough to matter. Coastal radar emissions continued in uneven pulses. Every spike, every fade, every shift was logged. The picture was still crowded, but control had shifted. American forces now owned the tempo. On the bridge, the captain scanned between the sea lanes ahead and the sectors where Iranian boats had pulled back. Merchant traffic continued moving through the strait, a reminder that even at the edge of confrontation, commercial life in Hormuz never fully stops. That contrast made everything sharper. Civilian ships moved through the same space where bombers, warships, helicopters, and airborne troops had just imposed a new reality. At 6:33, the first full accountability report came in from the ground. Primary elements assembled, outer security established, landing complete. No extra words followed. They weren't needed. The message carried weight on its own. What had entered by air had arrived intact, organized on the ground, and done so under direct observation from forces positioned all around the area. That was the part no one had managed to interrupt. They had seen the bombers, tracked the transports, watched the parachutes open, sent boats toward the edge, and still the sequence had continued exactly as planned. At 6:35, one Iranian patrol vessel adjusted course again, turning broadside briefly before settling into a more distant parallel track. It remained present, still watching, but distance itself had become a signal. The sharper probing from earlier was gone. No one on the American side mistook that for surrender. It was something more practical. Acceptance of the situation. The MH-60 climbed higher and widened its orbit, no longer needing to block a direct approach. On the destroyers, weapons crews stayed ready, sensors remained fixed, and communications stayed disciplined. Nothing became casual, but the urgency had changed. It was no longer about protecting the insertion. That part was already done. Now, it was about holding the result. High above, the final trace of the B-52 presence was not sound, but structure. Even as they moved away, their earlier role remained imprinted on everything that had followed. They hadn't needed to descend. They hadn't needed to act. Their impact had come the moment every radar, every patrol crew, every decision-maker had been forced to look up and rethink the entire situation. But the bombers were never the whole message. By the end, that was clear. The real message was sequence. Air power arrived first and reshaped the sky. Protected transports moved through the corridor. Paratroopers stepped into the wind and landed on time. Warships held the surface. A helicopter blocked close approach. The opposing side tested the edges and found no gap. That was the outcome. Not a sudden clash, not a dramatic exchange. Something quieter and harder to counter. Control. At 6:38, the tactical log aboard the lead escort showed a clean chain of events. Bomber entry, corridor established, transport descent, jump initiated, drift corrected, surface probe, warning sequence, deceleration, consolidation ashore, timestamps, bearings, speeds, distances, every minute recorded, every action preserved. No one declared success. Professionals rarely do in real time. The record spoke for itself. By 6:40, Iranian boats were still visible on radar, but only as observers at the edge of a completed operation. The American formation continued forward. The inserted troops held their ground. The corridor that had seemed ready to ignite at dawn had instead been crossed, shaped, and used. And that was the final surprise of the morning. The expectation had been to watch the bombers. What actually entered Hormuz was something far more complete. A full sequence by air, by sea, and by timing. And for one long stretch of morning, over the narrowest waters in the Gulf, no one was able to stop it.